While completing his research for a biography of Thomas Jefferson, writer Henry S. Randall visited Monticello. He met with Thomas Jefferson's oldest grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph. During one of his interviews with Randolph, the topic of Sally Hemings came up. This question would likely have been expected, given the rumors have been going around since at least 1802, when James T. Callender accused Jefferson of fathering children with a slave by the name of Sally. At that time, Callender wrote, quote, "It is well known that the man, whom it delighteth the people to honor, keeps and for many years has kept as his concubine one of his slaves. Her name is Sally. The name of her eldest son is Tom. His features are said to bear striking through the sable resemblance to those of the president himself. The boy is 10 or 12 years of age. His mother went to France in the same vessel with Mr. Jefferson and his two daughters. The delicacy of this arrangement must strike every person of common sensibility. What a sublime pattern for an American ambassador to place before the eyes of two young ladies." These accusations were not limited to a single child, with Callender going on to write, quote, "By this wench Sally, our president has had several children. There is not an individual in the neighborhood of Charlottesville who does not believe this story, and not a few who know it." So well known were these accusations that reportedly during his re-election campaign, his opponents changed the lyrics of Yankee Doodle to, quote, "When pressed by loads of state affairs, I seek to sport and dally. The sweetest solace of my cares is in the lap of Sally." Thomas Jefferson Randolph did not dodge the question, speaking directly to Randall about the controversy and providing an explanation. Randall wrote to a friend that Randolph admitted, quote, "She had children which resembled Mr. Jefferson so closely, it was plain that they had his blood in their veins. He said in one instance, a gentleman dining with Mr. Jefferson looked so startled as he raised his eyes from the ladder to the servant behind him, that his discovery of the resemblance was perfectly obvious to all." But Thomas Jefferson Randolph had an explanation for this. He told Randall what he said was a family secret. He told Randall that Hemings' children were of the Jefferson bloodline, but not Thomas Jefferson. He said that Hemings' children were fathered by Thomas Jefferson's nephew, Peter Carr. To Randall, this seemed a very plausible explanation. Thomas Jefferson was known to be a mentor to Carr, and Carr lived at Monticello for many years. He had moved away in 1798 to his own 900-acre plantation known as Carrsbrook, but by all accounts still remained a regular visitor to Jefferson's home, living less than 10 miles away, with Charlottesville between the two plantations. In addition, Carr and his brother had a notorious reputation for requesting sexual favors from enslaved women when visiting fellow plantation owners. Another grandchild of Jefferson, Ellen Randolph Coolidge, wrote Carr was, quote, "the most notorious good-natured Turk that ever was master of a black seraglio, kept at other men's expense." Randall also reported being told that Jefferson's daughter, Martha, had said on her deathbed that Thomas Jefferson had been away from Monticello for 15 months before one of Sally Hemings' children had been born, proving that he was not the father. But after telling Randall this, Randolph asked that his family secret not be included in the upcoming book, as Carr's behavior was an embarrassment to the Jefferson family. Randolph, likely believing this explanation, agreed, and his 3-volume biography entitled The Life of Thomas Jefferson, which was published in 1858, only referenced the rumors as, quote, "invented," and a story made up by Jefferson's political opponents. 10 years later, in 1868, Randall exchanged letters with another author by the name of James Parton, who was also writing a biography on Thomas Jefferson, which would be entitled The Life of Thomas Jefferson, 3rd President of the United States. Parton wrote, quote, "The father of those children was a near relation of the Jeffersons, who need not be named," but he also cited a letter that he received from Henry S. Randall, which stated, quote, "Mr. Jefferson had 2 nephews, Peter Carr and Samuel Carr. Colonel Randolph informed me that Sally Hemings was the mistress of Peter, and her sister Betsy the mistress of Samuel, and from these connections sprung the progeny which resembled Mr. Jefferson." A few years later, additional evidence came forward that seemed to corroborate this account. An overseer who had worked at Monticello by the name of Edmund Bacon was interviewed in 1862, and he reportedly said that he had never seen Jefferson and Hemings together in a way that he thought was sexual. He said of Jefferson, quote, "He freed one girl some years before he died, and there was a great deal of talk about it. She was nearly as white as anybody, and very beautiful. People said he freed her because he was his own daughter. She was not his daughter. She was daughter. I know that. I have seen him come out of her mother's room many a morning, and I went up to Monticello very early." The name was omitted by the interviewer, but was presumed by most historians to be referring to either Peter Carr or perhaps his brother Samuel. The relationship with Peter Carr would also explain why Hemings and her children and some members of the family received preferential treatment in Monticello. Jefferson's will specifically freed Hemings and 4 of her relatives, while 130 other slaves were sold at auction. Jefferson only formally freed 2 slaves during his lifetime, 2 of Hemings' brothers. Hemings' oldest surviving children, while not formally given freedom, were allowed to leave Monticello once they came of age without any consequence. Not only were they allowed to leave, they were given payment. Given all of this, the narrative of most mainstream historians on the topic for the next over 100 years was that Thomas Jefferson's nephew had fathered children with Sally Hemings, and Jefferson hid this secret to protect his nephew. But there's one serious problem with this narrative. It's not true. In 1997, DNA evidence showed that Eston Hemings, Sally's last child, who was born in May of 1808, was almost certainly a member of the Jefferson family, but was not related to Peter Carr or his brother Samuel. Following the DNA evidence, there were about 25 adult males who were alive during this time who could potentially have been the father, including Jefferson himself. 19 of them lived more than 100 miles away from Monticello, with no documentation of them ever visiting. 2 more, George Jefferson Jr. and John Garland, lived about 70 miles away, and while both likely visited Monticello on occasion, neither was a regular visitor in either 1808 or during any of the other conception windows for other Hemings children. That left Thomas Jefferson, his brother Randolph, and some of Randolph's older adult children. Jefferson's brother Randolph had his own 2,000-acre plantation about 20 miles away and had 30 slaves of his own on that plantation. Researchers who have gone through all of the various records, which include Jefferson's letters and diaries, have only found 4 visits to Monticello by Randolph. One was in September of 1802, one in September of 1805, one in May of 1808, and a final one in 1814. None of these visits were during conception windows for any of Hemings' children. Jefferson did apparently write Randolph an invitation to come and visit Monticello during what could have been Eston's conception window, but there's no indication in his diary or any of the logs that he came to Monticello or accepted the invitation. Some of Randolph's children did come to Monticello and even stayed for periods of time, but only intermittently, and they were all significantly younger than Hemings, the oldest being 8 years younger. So while they may have been old enough to father Eston, even the oldest of Randolph's children would have only been 13 when Hemings' oldest confirmed child was conceived. Defenders of Jefferson argued the lack of documentation of Randolph visiting doesn't prove he wasn't a frequent visitor, pointing to accounts that stated, quote, "Old Master's brother, Mas Randall, was a mighty simple man, used to come out among black people, play the fiddle and dance half the night. Hadn't much more sense than Isaac." But even if you believe Randolph was a more frequent visitor, you would still need to explain why Hemings was left at Monticello when Randolph had his own plantation 20 miles away, which already housed 30 slaves. Why would Jefferson keep Hemings with him at Monticello rather than send her to live with Randolph if Randolph were the father of even some of the 6 children born at Monticello, particularly after the scandal in 1802? And why would Jefferson's family choose to frame Peter Carr rather than admit it was Randolph Jefferson, as both men died in 1815? Of the 2 men, Peter Carr was actually more notable, being a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. The overseer's account, Edmund Bacon, is also suspect, as he didn't even begin working at Monticello until around 1806, meaning the only child he would have been present for the conception of would have been Eston, as all of the other children were born prior to his employment. And Martha Jefferson's claims of a 15-month window are not true, given Jefferson's own records showing that he returned to Monticello during each of Hemings' conception windows. This despite those same records showing that Jefferson was likely away from Monticello as much as 70% of the time between 1795 and 1808, the years most of Hemings' children were born. To put it another way, despite being at Monticello only about a quarter of a time over 14 years, Thomas Jefferson happened to be present during 6 separate conception windows for each of the Hemings' children born. The research team that confirmed this was led by a man by the name of Dumas Malone. Malone was a Thomas Jefferson biographer and the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Professor of History at the University of Virginia. He was attempting to disprove Hemings' rumors by showing Jefferson's absence, but found the opposite. There are also contemporary accounts beyond Callender's accusations. In 1811, Elijah Flesher visited Jefferson at Monticello and wrote in his diary, quote, "Republicans as well as Federalists in his own county dislike him and tell many anecdotes much to his disgrace. I confess I have never had a very exalted opinion of his moral conduct, but from the information I gained of his neighbors, who must best know him, I have a much poorer one. The story of Black Sal is no farce. That he cohabits with her and has a number of children by her is sacred truth. And the worst of it is he keeps the same children slaves, an unnatural crime, which is very common in these parts." A friend of Jefferson, named John Hartwell Cook, who worked with Jefferson to build Monticello, wrote in his diary in 1853, quote, "Were cases of interracial sex enumerated, they would be found by the hundreds. Nor is it to be wondered at when Mr. Jefferson's notorious example is considered." And there is one account which was contemporary and largely holds up to both the DNA evidence and historical scrutiny, and that is the account of Sally Hemings' son, Madison. In 1873, the Pike County Republican newspaper published an interview with Madison, where he recounted what his mother had told him as well as what he had seen and observed. Madison stated that his great-grandmother was African, likely coming directly from Africa, as he believed the Hemings surname had come from the captain of the slave ship that had brought her. He had only heard of one other white man with the name Hemings, and that was that captain. His great-grandmother was sold in Williamsburg, and at the time of purchase, his great-grandmother was pregnant with Captain Hemings' child. Reportedly, his grandmother and the captain were in Williamsburg when his great-grandmother gave birth to his grandmother, Elizabeth Hemings, and Captain Hemings offered to purchase the child, acknowledging he was the father, but the owner refused to sell. Madison believed John Wales was the man who purchased his great-grandmother, although some accounts indicate Elizabeth, also known as Betty, was given to John Wales as a wedding present when he married Martha Epps. Madison reported that Betty was raised in the Wales home, and that after his wife Martha died and Elizabeth grew into womanhood, Wales then fathered 6 children with Betty, 3 boys and 3 girls, including Sally Hemings. All of them were given the Hemings name. When Betty's oldest child was born, she was at most 18, while Wales was 38. One of Wales' legitimate children was Martha Wales, better known to history as Martha Jefferson, the wife of Thomas Jefferson. Martha married Thomas Jefferson in 1772, about a year before Sally was born. In the same year that Sally was born, 1773, John Wales died. Betty Hemings and her 6 children, who were by most accounts were Martha Jefferson's half-siblings, were forced to move to Monticello and become the property of Thomas Jefferson. In 1782, Martha Jefferson died. She and Jefferson had had 6 children together, but only 2 who survived to adulthood. Both were daughters. Jefferson was selected to be Minister of France in 1784, and a request was made that his daughter and Sally's brother James Hemings be sent to join him in Paris. Martha was just 12 at the time, being born a year before Sally. James was 19 years old, and Jefferson wanted him to train in French culinary techniques. In 1787, Thomas Jefferson requested that his youngest daughter, Mary, also be brought to Paris. Mary was just 9 at the time, and was accompanied by Sally, who was 14. Few dispute that Wales was the father of Betty Hemings' 6 children, including Sally, and most serious scholars do not dispute the fact that James and Sally were in Paris with Jefferson during this time. But that wasn't the end of Madison's story. The article stated, quote, "But during that time, my mother became Mr. Jefferson's concubine, and when he was called back home, she was enceinte by him. He desired to bring my mother back to Virginia with him, but she demurred. She was just beginning to understand the French language well, and in France she was free, while if she returned to Virginia, she would be re-enslaved. So she refused to return with him. To induce her to do so, he promised her extraordinary privileges, and made a solemn pledge to her that her children should be freed at the age of 21 years. In consequence of his promises, on which she explicitly relied, she returned with him to Virginia. Soon after their arrival, she gave birth to a child, of whom Thomas Jefferson was the father. It lived but a short time. She gave birth to 4 others, and Jefferson was the father of all of them. Their names were Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston, 3 sons and 1 daughter. Madison's account is consistent with French law at the time. James and Sally would have been free if they remained in Paris, and by most accounts, James by this point had enough skill as a chef that he would likely have been able to find employment in Paris. Later that same year, the Pipe Republican paper published another article interviewing a formerly enslaved man by the name of Israel Jefferson, who was born at Monticello in 1797, who stated in his interview, quote, "I know that it was a general statement among the older servants at Monticello that Mr. Jefferson promised his wife, on her deathbed, that he would not again marry. I also know that his servant, Sally Hemings, mother to my old friend and former companion at Monticello, Madison Hemings, was employed as his chambermaid, and that Mr. Jefferson was on the most intimate terms with her, that, in fact, she was his concubine. This I know from my intimacy with both parties, and when Madison Hemings declares that he is the natural son of Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, and that his brothers Beverly and Eston and his sister Harriet are the same parentage, I can as conscientiously confirm his statement as any other fact which I believe from circumstances, but do not positively know." On hearing of this article, Thomas Jefferson Randolph once again came to the defense of his grandfather, writing in a rebuttal to the article, quote, "To my knowledge, and the statements other gentlemen made to me 60 years ago, the paternity of these persons, Sally's children, was admitted by 2 other persons." But again, Randolph had stated one of these other persons was Peter Carr, and was likely inferring the other was his brother, Samuel Carr, but neither matched the DNA evidence found in 1997. Parton's autobiography on Jefferson was published the following year, in 1874. Parton dismissed Madison and Israel's accounts as being manipulated by the journalists who interviewed them. He again provided the Peter Carr narrative, arguing Jefferson was away from Monticello far too often from the father of Hemings' children. But again, the DNA evidence shows that Peter Carr was not the father, and the research shows that Jefferson was at Monticello during all of the conception windows. Most people who argue Thomas Jefferson was not the father of Sally Hemings' children will point to his brother Randolph or one of Randolph's sons, but no other accounts at the time ever indicated that Randolph or any of his sons were the likely parents. They indicated Peter Carr, or possibly Samuel Carr, and there was really no reason to suspect Randolph or his sons. Why would you? Randolph owned his own plantation 20 miles away. Why would he keep a sexual slave at Monticello rather than at his own plantation? And why would Jefferson allow him to do so even after the political controversy in 1802? Why would the family claim it was Peter Carr, a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, rather than just say it was Randolph Jefferson when both men died in the same year? The most likely explanation is that it is much more believable that Peter Carr, or perhaps his brother Samuel Carr, were the ones who had done such things, as they already had a reputation of demanding sexual favors from slave women. Peter Carr, fathering slave children at Monticello, was a believable story. Thomas Jefferson, attempting to hide this to protect his nephew who was also his mentor, was a believable story, but it wasn't a true story. It was a narrative that was created to protect the legacy of Thomas Jefferson. All of the discussion and all the biographies up to this point were largely around Thomas Jefferson, his family, and the impact of these accusations, which is why at this point I think it's important to shift away from a discussion of Thomas Jefferson and his family to a discussion of Sally Hemings and her family. In 1847, Isaac Jefferson, who had been enslaved at Monticello, gave an interview which became the book Memoirs of a Monticello Slave. In it he said, quote, "Sally Hemings' mother, Betty, was a bright mulatto woman, and Sally mighty near white. She was the youngest child. Folks said that these Hemings was old Mr. Wales' children. Sally was very handsome, long straight hair down her back. Thomas Jefferson Randolph described her as, quote, light-colored and decidedly good-looking. When Sally arrived in France, she was 14 years old, while Thomas Jefferson was 44 years old. Sally and Thomas Jefferson's youngest daughter stayed with Abigail Adams briefly after their arrival, and Abigail Adams wrote a series of letters to Jefferson which mentioned Sally. Adams wrote, quote, "The girl who is with her is quite a child, and Captain Ramsey is of the opinion will be of so little service that he bid carry her back with him. But of this you will be a judge. She seems fond of the child, and appears good-natured." In other letters, Abigail described her as appearing, quote, about 15 or 16, and while Sally was supposed to be caring for Jefferson's daughter, quote, "The girl she has with her wants more care than the child, and is wholly incapable of looking properly after her, without some superior to direct her." Hemings' brother James had been in Paris since 1784, brought by Jefferson to learn cooking techniques. He was also paid a small wage of $4 a month by Jefferson, perhaps because slavery was not legal in Paris at the time, and James used this money to pay for a tutor to teach him the French language. James Hemings was Jefferson's lead chef during his time in Paris, and James invented a dish called macaroni pie, which most scholars agree was the origin of macaroni and cheese. For most of her time in Paris, James and Sally lived with Jefferson, while Jefferson's daughters were away at boarding school. Sally was also reportedly paid around $2 a month, again likely because of the French law prohibiting slavery, but this was significantly less than the $8 to $12 a month most Parisian servants were paid at the time. Sally was there for a little over 2 years, during which time Jefferson is known to have purchased formal clothing, possibly be able to accompany her daughters to formal events. As discussed before, according to Madison, she became pregnant by Jefferson during this time, and at 16 years old she returned to Monticello. This was when Madison wrote that Jefferson, quote, promised her extraordinary privileges and made a solemn pledge that her children should be freed at the age of 21 years. We'll never know why James and Sally decided to return with Jefferson, where they would have to return to slavery, rather than remain in Paris where they could have been free. But the storming of the Bastille, that would become the French Revolution, that had occurred earlier in that year, were almost certainly a factor. Jefferson had formally requested a return prior to the storming of the Bastille, but his leaving was delayed several times, and initially it appeared he planned to return far sooner. All of this is consistent with Madison's account of events. The passage from Paris would have taken 4 weeks. Madison's account of what happened next was that, quote, soon after their arrival, she gave birth to a child, of whom Thomas Jefferson was the father. It lived but a short time. While there is no evidence of this pregnancy or birth beyond this account, there is substantial evidence of, quote, extraordinary privileges being given to Hemings, her children, and some members of her family. According to Madison, quote, it was her duty all her life, which I can remember, up to the time of father's death, to take care of his chamber and wardrobe, look after us children, and do such light work as sewing. All of Hemings' children were taught skilled trades, unlike many other slaves left to field work on the plantation. Hemings' tasks were described as being nursemaid companion, lady's maid, chambermaid, and seamstress. She likely lived in a room adjacent to Jefferson's bedroom in the main house rather than the general slave quarters. The 4 Hemings children who survived to adulthood were allowed to leave on or around their 21st birthday, just as Madison described. Her oldest daughter Harriet and her son Beverly left together in 1822 to move to Washington, D.C. Again, as Edmund Bacon wrote of Harriet, quote, she was nearly as white as anybody and very beautiful. He described her leaving by writing, quote, when she was nearly grown, By Mr. Jefferson's direction, I paid her stage fare to Philadelphia and gave her $50. I have never seen her since and don't know what became of her. From the time she was large enough, she always worked in the cotton factory. She never did any hard work. This is confirmed by Jefferson's farm book, which stated they were given $50, which would be worth about $1,000 today. Bacon did deny that Harriet was Jefferson's daughter in that very same paragraph, but again, Bacon wasn't at Monticello until 1806, 5 years after Harriet was born. But confirmation of the event coming from someone who was trying to protect Jefferson's reputation makes it hard to dispute the event happened. According to Madison, quote, Beverly left Monticello and went to Washington as a white man. He married a white woman in Maryland, and their only child, a daughter, was not known by the white folks to have any colored blood coursing through her veins. Beverly's wife's family were people in good circumstances. Harriet married a white man in good standing in Washington, D.C., whose name I could give but will not, for prudential reasons. She raised a family of children, and so far as I know, they were never suspected of being tainted with African blood in the community where she lived or lives. I have not heard from her for 10 years, and do not know whether she is dead or alive. She thought her interest on going to Washington to assume the role of a white woman, and by her dress and conduct, as such I am not aware that her identity as Harriet Hemings of Monticello has ever been discovered. Madison and Eston were both freed on Jefferson's death. Sally was not formally freed in the will, but was, quote, given her time, and wanted to live with her sons in Charlottesville. In 1793, James Hemings was able to negotiate a contract with Jefferson, which stated, quote, having been at great expense and having James Hemings taught the art of cookery, desiring to befriend him, and to require him as little in return as possible, I hereby do promise and declare that if the said James should go with me to Monticello in the course of the ensuing winter, when I go to reside there myself, shall there continued he shall have taught such a person that I place under him for that purpose to be a good cook, the previous condition being performed, he shall thereupon be made free. While this may have been due in part to laws in Pennsylvania, where Jefferson and James were living at the time forbidding slavery, it was quite an extraordinary contract to make with a slave. For context on how extraordinary this was, during his lifetime, Thomas Jefferson owned around 600 slaves at one point or another, but he freed only 10, all of whom were members of the Hemings family. In 1794, Sally's brother Robert was allowed to purchase his freedom. He was the first slave ever freed by Jefferson, and again, only for payment. In 1795, Sally's mother was given her own cabin at Monticello from 1795 to 1807, where she was allowed to sell produce to the Jefferson household, but she was never formally freed. In 1796, Jefferson honored his contract with James, granting him his freedom. James traveled to Europe for a time before returning to Philadelphia to work as a cook, before later moving to Baltimore. During Jefferson's presidency in 1801, Jefferson offered James a job cooking at the White House. Hemings sent a response to a third party which said, quote, I have spoke to James according to your desire, and he has made mention again, as he did before, that he was willing to serve you before any other man in the Union, but since he understands he would have to be among strange servants, he would be very much obliged to you if you would send him a few lines of engagement on what conditions and what wages you would please to give him with your own handwriting. Jefferson never wrote back. James briefly worked at Monticello again, receiving $30 in wages for a month and a half of work before returning to Baltimore to work as a cook in a tavern. While living there, he committed suicide, dying at the age of 36. At Jefferson's request, a friend of Jefferson looked into the matter and wrote, quote, the report respecting James Hemings having committed an act of suicide is true. I made every inquiry at the time this melancholy circumstance took place, the result of which was that he had been delirious for some days prior to committing the act, and it was the general opinion he was drinking too freely was the cause. In addition to Eston and Madison, Jefferson freed Sally's half-brother, John Hemings, her nephews, Burwell Colbert and Joseph Fawcett. But even exceptional privileges for the Hemings family had limits. Sally's sister Mary had been leased to a man by the name of Thomas Bell to work as a seamstress while Jefferson was in France. During this lease, Mary had 2 children with Thomas Bell. Bell asked to purchase Mary from Jefferson to be able to free her so she could become his common-law wife. Jefferson agreed to sell Mary and the 2 children she had with Bell, but he refused to sell the 2 that had been born prior while she had been living at Monticello. These children were 11 and 9 at the time. One of these children was freed in Jefferson's will, Joseph Fawcett, but the daughter, Betsy Hemings, was given to Jefferson's daughter Mary as a wedding gift, along with 29 other slaves, when she was just 14 years old. Betsy reportedly had children with Mary's husband, John Wales Epps, after Mary died in 1804. When Betsy died, her body was buried next to John Wales Epps in the family cemetery. Over 5 generations, as many as 70 descendants of the Hemings family were enslaved at Monticello at one point or another. And regardless of if you believe Thomas Jefferson was the father of Sally Hemings' children, there is no debate that Jefferson kept her enslaved in circumstances where, at best, he allowed his family to use her sexually, and kept the children of these acts enslaved. And these kind of events were not isolated to Jefferson and his family. In 2020, the American Journal of Human Genetics found that DNA samples from Black Americans showed that Black women made a much larger contribution to the modern gene pool than black men, despite men making up roughly 60% of those who were enslaved. In this group, European men were 3 times more likely to be the source than European women. This is consistent with enslaved black women being systematically forced into sexual slavery by white owners on a massive scale. History is awkward.